Bob Ray is a senior counsel to the law firm Olthuis. Olthuis, it sounds almost Roman.
Olthuis is it's a Dutch name. It's actually the Canadian pronunciation. In Dutch it would be Olthuis.
Kleer, is that Dutch as well?
Dutch as well. Dutch. We have a couple of Dutch Reform devotees.
And Townshend, LLP, and teaches public policy and governance at the University of Toronto. He has been elected 11 times federally and in Ontario. Bob served as Ontario's 21st Premier as well as interim leader of the Liberal Party of Canada from 2011 to 2013. He's married to Arlene Pearlie Ray and lives in Toronto. He is currently the special envoy to the Rohingya crisis. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Good to be with you, Nigel.
This is a podcast about books, and I'd like to, this is a bit, it's not current, but it's certainly topical, a book that you wrote just prior to the previous election.
That's right.
Called What's Happened to Politics. On the back cover it says that you put forward a vision for the future of politics and a call for a more inclusive political process. So was that your primary objective, putting that book out at the time that you did?
Well, it was more to talk about, to try to explain a little bit how, in my experience, my personal experience, how politics has changed. And I was taking the reader a little bit through, my political experience starting in 1978 when I was first elected to the House of Commons, and then to when I left in 2013, and how I'd definitely seen an evolution.
Who's that? I wonder. I've had lots of sirens in the background.
That's right. They're not coming for me.
No.
In case you're wondering. All my books have a kind of personal element. People would say it's the narcissist in every politician. You can't. But to me, it's a way of trying to bring the reader into, this is how I've seen it, and then expand that a little bit to saying, and by the way, this is what we know from the literature, what we know, what's happening more broadly, more globally in terms of how this is affecting things. So I think the point of the book is really to talk about how we need to understand that the political process has become more partisan, more angry, and that everything in the social media world that we're seeing is just blowing this up. And I'm actually working on another book now called Truth and Consequences, which is a sequel to this book, and it goes into the work I've been doing in Indigenous politics in the country and the work I've been doing on the Rohingya crisis, and how these kind of come together in a process that is not positive. It's not because I'm a pessimist. I'm not pessimistic. No. I don't say let's all give up and move to a desert island, but it is to say these are challenging times.
Yeah, I mean the book itself was although you said it wasn't partisan, it really did heap a lot of criticism on Harper.
Sorry, I just couldn't help it.
Yeah. Your team won, and we got pretty well exactly the same kind of thing. Lies, bullshit. So my question is, if you, as a senior member of the ruling party, can't do anything, how can ordinary Canadians hope to make a difference?
Well, first of all, part of me would take issue with your, overall description of saying, well, it's exactly the same.
But policy-wise, it's not.
No,
but certainly
that's what I mean.
The lies and the broken promises, we got a lot of lies, we got a lot of broken promises.
Well, again, that's your opinion,
well,
to which you're entitled.
Reform, for example.
To which you're entitled.
Election reform, for example.
I would have liked to see more election reform. I've always been an advocate for election reform.
You proposed that in the book.
I proposed it in the book. I believe in it. I believe it should happen.
And you're one of you're a member of this party. You're a senior member of this party, and it didn't happen.
Who left in 2013? No, I didn't leave the party, but I left.
You left
I left a political
levers of power.
I left a political role, and I wanted to pursue two things. I wanted to do more teaching, because I kind of see that as, where I'm headed in the future in terms of my own life and role in terms of what I do. And also because I wanted to work more on the Indigenous issue in Canada, which I've been able to do at the law firm where we're sitting now.
Mm-hmm.
So those two things have come together, and I've been asked to take on this role in the Rohingya crisis. So that's also been a very difficult but completely fascinating exercise. I don't feel that I've had much influence over what's happened in Ottawa. I mean, I'm not. I can assure you, I'm not on the end of any phones with people. That isn't what happens.
That's what I was saying.
When you go, you're gone, and that's a general rule in politics. When you leave, you're not there, and when you're not there, you don't get called much. And that's not to be critical of anybody, because that's just a reality of how it works.
Change, yeah.
Yeah, but it's also politics is a bit of a cauldron, and I think the people who are in the cauldron say, if you're not in here, you have no idea how hot it is. So we're not calling you because you decided to leave, and you've gone off to do your thing. Mm-hmm. That's fine, and we're going to have to deal with whatever we have to deal with. I do think some of the trends that I noticed in what was happening in politics in a number of places. Look at how politics has been practiced since the age of John Kennedy. There's always been this element of showmanship. There's also been this element of very strong, fairly strict discipline and an effort to control things, an effort to kind of manage the public opinion and public relations in a much more kind of professional way, if you like, in a way that drew in from the commercial world of advertising and the commercial world of communication.
You call it the aura of phony salesmanship.
Yeah, there's a lot of that, and that hasn't changed. I mean, that is the culture in which all politics is operating. So what you need is a very powerful bullshit detector.
I don't think you need a very powerful one.
No, but a good one would help, an accurate one. And also you need to, I think, do a lot to help the public understand the process and also understand what they're being fed and why they're being fed it in a particular way. And I think that that's even stronger now in terms of social media, how the social media is creating a unique climate. And plus, we've got the P.T. Barnum of salesmanship in the United States. I mean, So he kind of represents the epitome of how this process has gone. He's not people say he's a businessman. He's a businessman the same way, P.T. Barnum or a carnival barker is a businessman. He's not a businessman. He's a con man, and that's what he's trying to do.
Your father wasn't a con man.
Not at all.
Your father's doctoral thesis was entitled Public Opinion and Its Measurement. And he wrote a book with George Gallup called The Pulse of Democracy. Why did he leave the polling business?
Well, it was the war. He just married my mother, had come over from England. They met in England. He did his PhD at the LSE in London in the late 30s, and he met my mother there. My mother was an English woman who lived to be 100. She died in 2014, and she's a remarkable lady. My dad had died earlier in 1999, and she came over when the war was breaking out in September. He'd already moved to Princeton.
Did he realize that polling was not?
I think he felt he kind of he felt he'd done that, and I think the one comment he made to me, which I repeat in the book, which is that turning heads is more important than counting heads. Though actually, when he came to Ottawa, the first 2 or 3 years he was there, he worked on government polling because Mr. King, the Prime Minister, wanted to know what the public was thinking about the war, and in particular, he wanted to know what the public was thinking about conscription.
Yeah. Because
conscription had been a hugely divisive and difficult issue in the First World War in Quebec. You had riots in Quebec City, and it had divided the Liberal Party, and Laurier fought the election on his own because most of his cabinet from English Canada had left him and gone to join the coalition government, or the union government as it was called. And Mackenzie King was obsessed with what had happened and how he didn't want that to happen to the Liberal Party again. So he very much focused on how to deal with it and how to cope with it. And my father he was a very junior guy. I was 25 years old, but he was the one guy in the government who knew about polling. So he helped them to organize the assessment of public opinion that was going on, and the government was very actively engaged in the polling business. Not about so much about partisan stuff as it was about this one big issue.
How to reflect what the public wanted, I suppose?
Well, and how to deal with it. I mean, Mr. King was always criticized for being a ditherer. He actually wasn't so much a ditherer as he was somebody who didn't believe in taking action if you could possibly avoid it because you didn't know what the consequences of that would be. And eventually, I think, anyway. But that, you say, why did my dad do what he did? I think it's because he was very much a person of conviction, and he saw the limits, I think, of the polling business.
Okay. At that point, you say that as important as natural talent or strategy in a leader, because you have different sections, one's on leadership in the book, character is all important. And we don't see that right now.
I think we do in some ways with some people. I think the one thing we're learning to understand is that our leaders are human and make mistakes. And I think the other thing we understand better than ever is that the mistakes that our leaders make are more quickly and easily exposed. I mean, in politics in the past, a lot of things happened and people didn't talk about it.
Well, like Kennedy's womanizing. Yeah.
Well, that's one example. I mean, that's a good example, but there are lots of examples. I mean, Churchill's, drinking, or a whole bunch of stuff, that people kind of joked about, but nobody really talked about. Even Churchill's health. I mean, Churchill had, a series of strokes.
Yeah, depression.
During the time he was prime minister, he suffered from depression. Today, Churchill would have to be out there, giving speeches on mental health. I don't mean that just to be facetious, but it's a completely different time. So I think it's fair to say that the one challenge that everybody faces in public life today is that it's a life exposed. And I think for many people it makes them feel very uncomfortable. And when that life is exposed, sometimes there are elements in the life that are found to be wanting. And people have to live with that. I mean, Joe Biden plagiarized a speech and he had to withdraw from a leadership campaign. Now he's running again for the presidency. People don't ask him about, how that happened anymore.
They ask him about his son now.
Now they're asking something else, I mean, so everything you do is subject to exposure and criticism. And that, I think, is why it's more challenging and difficult to find heroes. And it's not to say that nobody in public life has a good character. I think a lot of people have good character. It's just that they're not perfect. They have frailties, and I think we all have to learn to live with those frailties when we look at leaders today.
As you say, previous leaders may have had these. They just either the media agreed that they weren't relevant or didn't feel that it was appropriate to cover them, whereas now anything goes.
There's a very good book I read years ago about President Roosevelt called The Splendid Deception. I can't remember the name of the author. He himself had polio, and he wrote this book about Roosevelt's health because he wanted to make a point about how Roosevelt had done an incredible job together with his political advisor, Louis Howe, who was the guy who kind of managed his campaigns at the beginning, was his early political advisor. And they had determined that if Roosevelt was seen as being sick or frail or weak, he wouldn't be taken seriously. So they basically were sort of really focused on how can we make sure that whenever you appear in public, you're going to be standing up.
Yeah, and I know his sons used to help him.
His sons used to carry him up and everything else.
Yeah.
There were no cartoons, very few cartoons, shouldn't say no, very few cartoons of Roosevelt in a wheelchair. Yeah. But he wasn't in a wheelchair. He was he couldn't walk. As this book author says all the time, he says, Roosevelt had polio. He could not walk. His legs were paralyzed. And yet the way he managed to present himself was that he was physically a man of great vigor. The second thing is...
It's a deception, isn't it?
Yes. That's why he calls it the splendid deception. Because the cause was, if you like, he was a leader who had many, many other great qualities of inspiration and so on. But, he himself had character flaws. People There were people who worked with him who didn't like him, who found him to be deceptive, and his personal operating style was complicated. But the other thing was that in the last 5 years of his life, he had terrible heart disease that was never disclosed to the public, never disclosed to anybody, to the point where at the end of his life, he was only allowed to get up for about 5-6 hours a day. He'd stay in bed for like 18 hours. They had, remember those days they had no statins, they had no pills, they had no blood pressure medication, they had no beta blockers. None of that existed. Yeah. All they said was don't eat too much salt, so he had to eat Eleanor's cooking, which was terrible.
That's what pushed them apart, is it?
Well, I think there were other things. But anyway, it's a fascinating thought that that here's the guy who was celebrated as the leader of the free world and was, fighting against Germany and Japan, and a great and vigorous leader. Yeah. And the reality was he was an extremely frail guy. He died at age 64 of a massive hemorrhage, when he was having his portrait done in Georgia.
But speaking of deception, and maybe that's too strong a word, but I interviewed John Ivison recently about his biography of Trudeau, and one of his conclusions is that we're not allowed to see the real person. They won't let him talk. They're just making him say talking points, and we don't get the real person because the real person screws up too much.
I think it's a highly managed operation. I think that's true, and I think the people.
So how do we get a character? How do we?
I think the power's gone down.
Thankfully this is still going.
Is it okay? And your batteries are operating.
Yeah. Sorry, you say it's a highly managed operation. Yeah.
Yeah, it's highly centralized. It's highly managed. It's very much trying to control the image and control the message.
Yeah.
And I think you can tell from what I've written and said, that was a part of politics that I always thought was bullshit. I mean, I just think it's overdone, and you've got to be able to carry it yourself. And you've got to be able to do
character. You can't tell what his character is because it's just talking points.
Well,
you can tell his character because of things that come out in the press.
I think the point that people are trying to need to come to terms with is that the Prime Minister, as I know him, is a person of tremendous energy, of a tremendous resilience, of tremendous emotional intelligence, and a person who has considerable abilities.
Yeah.
And none of those things are to be dismissed. And I think, often when you say, well, somebody said to me, he's not the smartest person in the room. And I said, doesn't matter. He's not. He's smart enough to know that he needs smart people around him.
And is he a good person? That's important too.
I personally think he is a good person. Mm-hmm. I think he has tremendous awareness of other people. And to me, the terrible irony of this
blackface,
all the blackface nonsense, is that I can't explain it. I can't. Somebody said to me, why would somebody do that?
Mm-hmm.
Why would somebody think it was a good idea to do that?
It's just colossal poor judgment, is what it is.
Well, I think it's challenging to find a good explanation except to say it was a mistake. But what I always find encouraging about the Prime Minister is his willingness to recognize those things and say, yeah, I screwed up.
And he didn't with Jody Wilson-Raybould, though.
Because that's a different story. I mean, that's a different issue in terms of, what is the substantive issue with respect to a deferred prosecution agreement for a large Canadian company that has, again, on their own admission, done some things that should never have happened. And then the question becomes, okay, what's the right policy choice for that kind of a... He wasn't alone in thinking that it was better to have the certainty of a deferred prosecution agreement than anything else.
No.
He wasn't the only person in Canada who thinks that.
But he was ignoring the rule of law.
I don't think so. I actually don't believe that. I actually think that's not right. I think the rule of law.
You don't interfere with prosecutions.
Well, actually, if you look at the law with respect to the deferred prosecution agreement, it is entirely appropriate for a government to decide after due consideration, and a minister of justice to decide after due consideration how you will proceed on a matter of a deferred prosecution agreement. It's completely different.
It's the Attorney General. It's not the Prime Minister.
Yeah, that's correct. And I think he understood that. I think he's repeatedly said it was always going to be her decision. Now, if you say to me, is this something that was handled perfectly? No, I think he admits he said it wasn't handled perfectly. If you say to me, he's not somebody who believes in the rule of law, I would say, no, that's not true.
Okay. You complain about incessant campaigning replacing governance.
Yeah, we live in the world of the permanent campaign. It didn't start with Mr. Trudeau, by all means. I mean, it started, I think, a long time ago in the U.S., and I think to some extent it's always been true that politics is a fact of life, and it's why people are in power is because of politics. That's how they got there. Yeah. So if somebody says, "Oh, they're just being political," you sort of say, "Well, how the hell do you think they got there?" Of course, they're going to be political,
and they want to stay there.
But there is a moment in the life of a government when it used to be. I mean, I'm just saying this is how I think you could see it. Would be a moment when you'd say, "Okay, we won the election. Now let's get back to business."
And so why didn't they implement what you wrote in this damn book?
Because I think
it's all full of wonderful suggestions.
Well, I think it is too. But I think because they feel that's all very well and good, but actually the way things are done now is by running these campaigns all the time. And I happen to think that in the end, people get fed up with it. People get totally turned off by it and totally frustrated by a House of Commons where one party is mouthing slogans,
calling each other racist,
and the other but it's also the sloganeering that goes on. It's the messaging. It's like
the repetitive.
I tell the story in the House where, after being away for 25 years, I come back as a new member in 2007 or 8, whatever it was. And I get invited to the first question period meeting and the rehearsal. I said, "What the hell's a rehearsal?" Yeah. And they said, "Oh, you have to rehearse your question." I said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, do you have it written down?" I said, "No, I've never written down my questions." "Why would you write them down?" You have to. I said, "Well, you need to know what you're going to be asking, and you need to know what you're saying." But I'm looking at you, Nigel, as we're talking, and the best way for me to communicate with you is to establish eye contact, and to be able to look at you. If I'm looking down and you're looking at my forehead, you can't.
That's all they do is read them out.
And speeches are not about reading something that's written. Speeches are about talking directly and communicating directly with people. Yeah. And that's the way you can tell whether you're losing an audience, because people start shaking their heads and their body language goes all cold and they look sideways at you, and I'm losing this guy. Like he's not when you disagree with what I'm saying, I can tell that you're not happy with what I'm saying. It doesn't mean I change what I'm saying, but it means you want to have an argument. You're going to put forward another point of view. Yeah, that's what a conversation is about. And what I'm saying is we've lost the art of a political conversation, because the House of Commons is one example, but there are millions of examples where nobody's having a conversation. And there are other aspects of of how you cope with people. A lot of times if you're having a sensible discussion with somebody, if we're talking about any topic, subconsciously I'm probably saying, I could be wrong, I could be wrong about this. But
that's the idea of a conversation, right, isn't it?
Because you're admitting that you're wrong. Yeah. You're admitting that you don't know the answer when you start the conversation.
And that you could change your mind.
Totally, because of what you say. Mm-hmm. Which is why, and here I am talking all the time, but which is why, and that's the trouble with the podcast, you're always talking, which is why listening is ultimately more important than talking. Mm-hmm. Because if you're listening, if you're actively listening to people, you're actually hearing something that they're telling you, and then you're saying, "Oh, okay, I could have done that differently, or maybe I should be thinking differently about this question." Yeah. And you're not just
and it's insulting too, isn't it?
Piling it on.
It's insulting just to talk talking points to someone else right past them. It's like you don't respect them, and there's the lack of respect in the House.
Yeah, there's a complete lack of respect, and there's also a complete lack of a willingness to admit that something that's being said actually could change your mind.
Yes.
And I think in my life, this is not just true professionally or politically, but it's also personal. I think probably most of the big mistakes that I've made in my life have been because I haven't listened. Like really listened.
Yeah.
And understood what the other person was trying to tell me.
In terms of being an interviewer, it's the most important thing. I have to listen to what you say. Otherwise, my questions will be out of left field and not relevant to what we're talking about.
Well, there's that famous Bob and Ray, Bob and Ray, the American comedians in the 50s.
Yeah, that might be a bit old for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know,
I'm pretty old.
You look like a kid.
That's
But,
for
I mean,
sure.
is a famous interview.
Bob and Ray?
Bob and Ray, yeah.
Never heard of. I've heard of Bob Ray.
Bob Ray, but Bob
But-
and Ray,
No, never heard of them.
two American comedians who are really funny,
Mm.
and you can get them on YouTube.
Okay.
And the best, you should get the YouTube interview on Komodo Dragon,
Okay.
because it's a classic case of the interviewer who doesn't listen. It's very funny.
Good. Well, I'll write
Plus
that down.
that one, plus the Slow Talkers of America, which is also very funny. But they have some genius takeoffs.
Okay.
And I would say the worst radio experiences that I've had, the worst interviews I've had,
Yeah.
have been with journalists who had a point of view and didn't want to be knocked off their point of view,
Yeah.
and didn't listen to a word you were saying, so that they would just you just end up going round in circles, having an argument,
Yeah.
which is like a Monty Python sketch where you're in the argument room because you're just having an argument. It's just ridiculous.
The most positive underlying force in any society is trust. When they are weakened, anything can happen. Like what? That's what you say. Anything can happen.
Well, I think mistrust leads to. Trust is a hugely undervalued thing in society. In fact, the retiring Governor General, a guy who was David Johnson, who was Governor General, wrote the book that he wrote recently called Trust, by that very name.
Yep.
And he talks about its importance in a number of different ways, in life, in business, in politics, in a whole variety of ways. But in every relationship, trust is critical. Whether it's 2 people, whether it's 10 people, or 20 people, or 40 people, or 80 people, whatever it may be. Mm. And I think once trust goes, then you're living in a society where it becomes entirely a function of power and who can get what, who can grab what, and who can take what and keep what, and no sense of mutual obligation, no sense of how what is fair dealing and how do you shake hands. Mm-hmm. I can remember a businessman that I was working with as premier, who came into my office, and where the province was in very bad shape, and he was seeking to do some, to establish a commercial relationship with the province in terms of some businesses that he wanted to help the province run and organize, and he'd had a bad previous experience with a bad experience with the previous government, where he thought he had an understanding of a sale of a business, and it didn't work out, and. He said, "I don't trust you. I don't, not me personally, but
Yeah.
I don't trust the government of Ontario, because you guys, you made it. You gave me your word and you didn't keep it." And I said, "Well, all I can say is we want to do business with your company, and we're gonna keep doing whatever we can to earn your business." Mm-hmm. And
so that's the for example, when a promise is made in an election, like we're going to do election reform and we don't do it, voters aren't going to trust that. So what the response should be is we still want to do it, we're going to try and do it, we're still here, it's not over.
Yeah, I think I went through this in my own political life. We committed to nationalizing auto insurance in Ontario. And after a year of working on it and looking at it and thinking about it every which way, I said, this isn't worth doing at the moment. We've got other bigger issues on our plate, so we're not going to do it. I went very public. I went to the public and said, we're not. I went to my cabinet, I went to the caucus, and they eventually, and there was a lot of internal argument, eventually they said, okay, we agree. And everybody said, well, you broke your promise. And I said, well, yeah, I didn't. After looking at something, I looked at it again, said, I'm not sure that's a great idea at the moment. And
I postponed my promise.
But look at it again, we'll do other things, we'll do other stuff. But yeah, if people say, well, did that affect your credibility? Absolutely. And similarly with Sunday shopping. I said we weren't going to do on Sunday shopping, and then as more and more people said, well, then we're going to vote with our feet. We're going to go down to Buffalo and shop, and what are you going to do to stop us? Nothing. And people were, businesses were coming in to see us saying, what are we supposed to do? How do we compete? And so eventually, again, that first year in government, I said, we're going to have a free vote on Sunday shopping. And people can make up their own minds. I know I've changed my mind. I suspect other people have changed theirs.
Yeah, and that's a sign of intelligence, changing your mind.
That's right. But then when you change your mind, Nigel, you break your word, because your word was given, and you said, this is what I'm going to do. It's not just about politics. It's true in life, right?
Yeah.
You kind of say, well, that was then and this is now, and things have changed, and so, and that's not to defend breaking your promise. It's to say that actually, in purely utilitarian terms, it's worse to keep a bad promise than it is to break a bad promise. If you think at the end it's a promise I can't keep. Now, what do you learn from that? You learn to make fewer promises. Because you better be damn sure that the one you're making is the one you can keep, because otherwise you completely lose the trust of people.
Why didn't Trudeau just say? Why didn't he just say, okay, I can't do it this term, but next term I will? But then they're saying
the problem that he had was, and I think really, this is where you get into an argument about what did they know when they knew it. But the fact is that when he talked about electoral reform, he had a specific idea in mind,
right?
Which was a ranked ballot.
Yeah.
And when the other parties talked about electoral reform, they had another idea in mind. And there are a whole variety of ways: proportional representation, and the Australian whatever method of counting the votes, switching. It's complicated, And so I think they just figured, well, we're not going to get there. This group wants to do this group wants to do that. We don't want to do this, they want to do that. I happen to believe that we won't get electoral reform in Canada until and unless we have a minority parliament where the parties say, if you want this parliament to keep going, we're going to have something on electoral reform.
Yeah.
That's one thing. The second thing is...
That's why minority governments are so good.
It can be.
Yeah.
I've been in several.
Pearson, for example.
Yeah, the Pearson government was, without question, was probably the most... In the 5 years of the Pearson government, it was the most productive government.
In our history,
Yeah. And I still believe that success has been underestimated by a lot of Canadians and a lot of people.
Yeah.
You get these periods of reform. It was interesting because Americans were going through some of the same changes in terms of their political changes. With Kennedy and Johnson, civil rights and Medicare for people over 65 and a whole bunch of other things they were doing. We were doing it, but the Pearson government was productive. It was chaotic.
Yeah.
But it was productive.
Inequality causes resentment to replace trust. These are all little gems that you're sprinkling throughout your book here.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that's happened in capitalism is that, and I talk about this in the other book that's on the table here, the Three Questions, is that we have gone through a period where we went through a period where there were huge gaps between rich and poor in the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. We then had a series of reforms, introduction of income tax, Social Security, a whole bunch of other changes. Then we had the Great Depression, which was another catastrophe, a rebuild after the Great Depression where people said we've got to do more to even things out and make sure that things aren't too unfair for people. And we maintained that after the war. There was kind of a deal to say, look, we're going to have businesses and we're going to have capitalism, but we're also going to have a degree of stability in the relationship between people. And that really began to get badly hit by this process of globalization and the direction of inequality, the growth of.
You say that globalization, for example, benefits those who already control wealth.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what we've seen. People, the rich get richer, and that's what's happened. And there's been this huge enrichment of people in a very intense period of time.
Yeah. Just going to quote you here. Yeah, this just is getting back to the kind of messaging that we hear all the time. Messaging has become narrow and repetitive, with every activity of the candidate a rote repeat of repackaged, whitewashed slogans defining the opposition in as vicious and dogmatic. And that's, you see Trump talking about the radical left Democrats.
Right.
Defining the opposition in as vicious and dogmatic a way possible is now only half the game. The other half is repeat the message that has been crafted as your brand.
Right.
So tying that into the fact that public discourse has fallen off badly.
Well, public discourse is, it's very difficult to have a conversation. I was talking earlier about conversation. It's very difficult to have a conversation with somebody who's just repeating propaganda all the time. We see this. It's a time of heightened propaganda, heightened messaging that's increasingly repetitive. The thing I think is quite interesting is that sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work because people just turn off. They hear the blather and they can't take it in anymore. They just turn it off.
Yeah. Well, you say, what can be done to ensure voters' voices are heard and politicians' platforms are honest and clear? So what?
Well, that's, I think, where we need to keep working on. We're now into the Gainsberger phase of an election campaign, where every day there's a new little trinket, right? A new little bite that's handed over to people.
Like what?
Well, I'm going to cut your taxes this way. Or I'm going to. I'm going to. If you're
I'm going to give you free.
I'm going to give you this
care.
free dental care. I'm going to give you this. And that, you sort of listen to that and you sort of say, well, yeah. And then what happens? So what happens if we have a recession in 6 months? Then what are you going to do?
Yeah.
So why isn't anybody asking that question? If you read the financial papers, they'll all say, 50% of asset managers, people who manage everybody's, money, pension money, or whether they're wealthy or everybody has you may not know it, but your money is being managed by somebody in some form or another. Even if you're getting the Canada pension plan, it's being managed by somebody.
Yeah.
50% of asset managers say, yeah, there's probably going to be a recession, and the only argument is exactly when and how bad is it going to be. And if you look at Europe and China, the trade wars, all the things, there's quite a lot of little storm clouds growing around. And so all these promises that are being made on the premise of, 2% growth and relatively full employment. And
blue skies.
Blue skies. And you say, well, what happens if the weather changes? What are you going to do then, buddy? And
especially with such a huge deficit now.
We have a big debt. We don't have a huge deficit. We have a big
deficit.
Debt. We have
relative to GDP, it's not bad.
Not bad. We're under control. It's all manageable. But it becomes a lot less manageable if there's a recession. And I'm not saying anything like disloyal or anything. That's just kind of like a fact. So what are you going to do if things, how long do you think you can go without there being a downturn? So what are you going to do in the downturn?
So here are these promises being poured out again.
Right.
And you can't keep them all.
No. Not at once.
So that's the problem is, I guess politicians think the more they promise, the more likelihood it is that they're going to get elected.
But the reality is that if people have turned you off, and you see this in a lot of campaigns, is that when people get turned off,
they just don't vote, right?
Well, no, but they don't believe anybody who says, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, and they just say, I'm sorry, you can make a promise a day, but it actually isn't going to change my mind about I don't like you. So if Nigel, you said to me, well, I'm going to give you $5, and you said, I don't believe you, I don't like it, $10, $15, $20. You go through the campaign making these promises and doing all these things.
I'd say, give it to me now, Bob. Give it to me now, then I'll vote for you.
Something will stick, It's always, it's funny in a way, but it's also crazy because all the system of communication, no reporters are not sitting around saying, well, okay, Prime Minister, can you please tell us what are you going to do when the economy, not if, but when the economy starts to slow down and things start to happen, because that's what happens in the life of a business cycle.
That's prudent leadership.
Yeah, we all know that. So what are your plans? Or Mr. Scheer, or Jagmeet Singh?
And the honest answer is, well, I won't be able to keep my promises.
Yeah, they say, well, how are you going to let the deficit go then? Is it going to be 50 or 75 or 100 billion? Like, what's the number? And these are like not. If you're at a shareholders meeting, people would say, well, what happens when the economy goes bad? What are you going to do then?
You didn't answer my question, though. Did you?
You have to remind me what it was.
I'm trying to look it up here.
That's not like me.
We're talking about the question was what? That's right. What can be done to ensure voters' voices are heard and politicians' platforms are honest and clear? So what can be done?
More direct communication by people who should know better about what's really at stake here. Now you're squinting, looking very skeptical.
Who are those people?
People like you and me, other people.
Well, we're doing our bit here.
Well, we are, but I'm just saying more people have to be doing this.
Like what?
Well,
podcasts?
What?
Podcasts?
Writing, doing everything we can to create a culture where you say, well, look, I'm sorry, you can't just do this anymore.
Questioning.
Yeah, you got to change the culture that politicians then say, okay, I guess I have to tell the truth. Yeah. And it's tough because you're up against a whole bunch of forces, some of which, frankly, are in the media is not really helping. The media like to think, and I once did a debate with some media people about this, and the media, one of the reporters said, we are the we put us in the swimming pool and we're there to clean it up. We're to clean up the muck in the swimming pool. And I said to the reporter, and I don't think they probably forgive me for it. I said, no, you're part of the muck.
That's right.
You're swimming in that stuff just as much as anybody else.
Yeah,
and
that's the problem. They're not unbiased.
No, they're not unbiased, but you can also see it in the cult of celebrity. The pundits who say, well, now so and so has called the Prime Minister a liar, so I've got to call him a scoundrel. And somebody else has said this about Scheer, so I've got to turn up the volume, or people are going to turn me off. The established media are doing everything they can to hold on to some element of market share. So they're desperately trying to figure out how do we, jack up the rhetoric and do something more that's going to magically save our business. No one really thinking through how do I create a different business model that's actually going to be more successful.
Okay, we're doing a lot of complaining here.
Well, not complaining, I'm observing.
No, but we are. We want solutions, though.
Well, I know it sounds awfully vague, but I think a lot of this. First of all, you change cultures, but then you can also change the laws. You can say, here's what parties have to do in an election campaign. You could have a legal framework for an election campaign which said you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this. To be fair to...
Well, sorry, even the, what was it, the budget, PB...
Parliamentary Budget Officer.
He's supposed to price out all these things, and the Liberals are avoiding that, it seems.
I think it's bad to do that. I think it's important for us to create as many...
they're doing something that you, for example, just recommended was introduced, and now they're trying to shirk that.
I think you have to find it. Well, they say they're going to do it. The point is when. And the point is it should be done promptly. Premier McGuinty actually brought in legislation that limited advertising of a partisan nature, and also said, a government has to put out its budget and has to indicate clearly where the parliamentary finances, where the public finances are prior to the election campaign, so that everybody knows. I think you've got to go even further than that. I think you've got to have very, very clear laws and rules. Same thing, I would do the same thing for debates. I would be very clear about.
Well, they're avoiding the damn debate.
Yes, he is avoiding a debate, but he's avoiding a debate that's been established by somebody that says, I'm having a debate, you've got to come. And we see that in,
What about the McLean's debate? He should have been there.
Why? Why?
Because the more opportunity that we have to judge him speaking on his feet.
What you need to do is what they did. They said, look, we're going to create a commission. It's going to be politically neutral.
Yeah, that's question mark.
Well, you can't. David Johnson was appointed by Stephen Harper. You can't. I mean, I've known David Johnson for 35 years. I have no idea how he votes. No idea what his politics are. He's never disclosed that to me. Okay. I've never thought of him as being a partisan person. Okay. But you've got to create more centers of objectivity that cannot be controlled by the party that's in power. You have to create more places where people are saying, sorry, in an election campaign, we demand that you tell us what things are going to cost, you tell us how you're going to pay for it, and you have as much objectivity as possible. And it's not beyond our scope to do that.
No, it's not. But, there were promises made to strengthen the role of the access to information, the commissioner that deals with that. And they've been avoiding that, too. I mean, it's harder now to get information out of the government than it's ever been.
Yeah, but I don't really agree with that. I mean, I think we live in an age where there's more information available, more stuff, facts. We're not suffering from any lack of information in our culture.
That's true.
I mean, I don't think that's a big problem.
Your chapter on leadership talks about three characteristics: vision, persuasion, implementation, and today's leaders rarely possess all three. The best leaders are well-rounded, determined, insightful, shrewd, and most important, able to command the attention of people around them.
And I think I would add to that, because I've been thinking more about it and reading more about it, thinking more about it. I think it all has to do with this ability to listen and also the ability to accept criticism. I was reading the other day, somebody said that the people that they thought were able to lead most effectively were people who were able to listen really carefully and also who were really able to accept criticism and accept the need to kind of say, well, that's your plan, but what do you think of my plan? Mm-hmm. So often we have this vision of a leader as like, Moses coming down from the mountaintop saying, I've got, here's the commandments and follow me. But as we all know from reading our Bible, Moses' journey was was a bumpy one, to put it mildly, and he never actually got to see the promised land. He got to see the promised land, but he didn't get to lead people to it. So I think by analogy, I think we expect our leaders to be, sometimes we expect them to be superhuman, and when you get into cults of leadership, which are unhealthy, those cults are based on people's desire for order and conformity, and they want to be led. They want to be dragged along and take me where you're going. I don't think that's what we would call good leadership today. I don't think that's a healthy thing.
Yeah, you say that polarization should not be the new norm. People want moderate, intelligent politics based on evidence, good values, and compromise.
Yeah, I believe that. I think it's true. I mean, obviously part of my education as a human being and education as a political person was based on my time in office, where, I made mistakes and the government, had to govern in a very difficult time, and it took me a while to kind of really, really feel comfortable that there were things that had to be done that were not going to be easy, but we had to do them. Mm-hmm. I felt that we needed to. And that where I think I failed was in my ability to bring everybody along. And obviously, split my party and lost the next election quite badly. So you sort of say, well, that didn't work out. And you say, well, no, it didn't. I don't think the effort to kind of find solutions was wrong, but obviously there was something missing in the implementation, to put it mildly.
I'm interested, though, about the command the attention of people around them. What do you mean by that? Exactly?
Well, I think you have to be able to persuade. You can't just govern by consensus. I mean, I watch. I mean, the Labour Party in England, which is one of the truly dysfunctional institutions of our time, and Corbyn as a leader, as leader of the party. Whenever things get difficult, he says, well, we've got to have another conference and we've got to have another meeting. And we've got to go back and, hear from the people and all this stuff. And to me, it's just a sign of weakness. He doesn't want to make a decision, doesn't want to get to that point. I think it's hard to succeed if you do that.
You can't be just a mirror.
No.
Purely majoritarian theories of democracy are not good enough. A richer view is required. So what's that richer view?
Well, it's a richer view that respects minority opinions and respects the rule of law and respects the fact that there are a lot of things that go into making a democracy. This cult of referenda, this cult of, the people have spoken when you have a majority of 51 or 52% is illusory. And it creates a sense that, if by appealing to this fictitious people who have one voice, that somehow is linked. What's linked to that is the theory that there's a leader who has a kind of pipeline to that one voice.
And I can't stand it when leaders say what Canadians want is. Right. That's just bullshit.
If you talk to Canadians, if you ever really go out and talk to Canadians, which I've done on a lot of occasions, you'll find that people have a whole variety of opinions, and that mostly the extremes on whatever side or whatever corner of the debate don't really command the majority support. But you really got to figure out how to work with people to build a consensus and an approach, and the approach that says, well, it's all about the power of the majority. Two or three things, I think. One is majorities can be wrong, just as minorities can be wrong. So we shouldn't make a cult of it. We need to understand that democracy is a lot more complicated than people think. It's a lot richer than people think. It's got a lot more nuance to it, and crevices and little places where people are able to be themselves.
Well, and it gets back to your point about listening.
Yeah.
Really, doesn't it?
Totally. But also respecting them, and I think that's one of the things that we live in a federal country, which I think is good. We live in a country where we have a Supreme Court, and we have a commitment to a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I think those are all very important features of our country.
Just winding down here, you talk about the fact that power is increasingly centralized and revolves around the personality and control of the Prime Minister and his advisors, and that it's true. I've long said this: is you get a majority government in Canada, and the Prime Minister can act like a dictator.
Well, only for very short periods of time, because the reality is that there are always limits on your power, even if you think you've got a majority. I mean, I ran a majority government for 5 years, and if you think that means that whatever you say goes, no, it doesn't, because you're in a framework of public opinion. You're in a framework of what's politically feasible and acceptable. And even if you think you've got a majority, the reality is your members can say, well, we're not going to support you if you do that. And
yes, but that's the corollary to this, is that MPs and party discipline turns them into bobbleheads.
No, it doesn't. I mean, it could in a cartoon maybe, But the reality is that when you go into a caucus meeting, you hear from members, and they have views.
Not in public, they don't.
Not always publicly, but the reality is that, I mean, I've been through this, right? I mean, I've lived this. Is that if members say, well, no, we can't agree with that, or we're not going to allow that to happen, you then face a situation where you have to climb down as leader. And if you climb down too
mutiny, I guess.
Yeah, but if you climb down too much, then you're done. That's just the reality. So you're always governing with a degree of support, and if you lose that support, you're pretty well done.
You make the point that toward the end of the book, and the book is that what's happened to politics, and Jerry Butts might agree with this, politics are too important to be left to politicians.
Well, I mean,
what do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is that we need to embrace the fact that we're all politicians. One of the things that I've always disagreed with is a sense that you hear from some journalists and some stuff on the social media and so on saying, "Oh, you politicians, you're all a bunch of you all do this." Yeah. So to say, well, you're implicated in this too. I mean, you're part of the political process. Everybody's part of the political process. Politicians are not members of some preordained class of people. They're just like you. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think people need to have that sense that they share in this responsibility. Sometimes politicians are doing things because they think that's what people want them to do, or what people are demanding that they do. They say, "Oh no, you have to do this," and then you do that, and it doesn't work, and then you turn around and say, "Uh-oh, we're in trouble." So there's got to be a much more honest dialogue between all of us about what do we expect from the political process. Yeah. Do you expect perfection? What in your personal life would lead you to think that any of these things are easy to do, or that you're asking,
getting people to agree to,
or you're asking people to say, well, do you want less of this? Everybody says, I want more health care. I'm getting older. Don't cut back on health care. You say, okay, that's actually the biggest part of the provincial budget. So what else do you want me to cut? Nothing. How about your taxes? Do you want to raise them? No.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a zero-sum game here.
It's going to be a little difficult to meet the test here.
Yeah.
So you kind of have to have and it's hard, I think. We get very caught up in demanding and getting angry when people say, well, and there's got to be much more of a dialogue. Say, okay, how do you want us to do this? How do we? How do you think we should proceed? There's no magic in this. There's a limit to what any government can spend. There's a limit to what any government can borrow. Yeah. And
often, as you say, it's a choice between awful and less awful.
Yeah, that's what it is. I mean, that's where I think one of the easy views is that you choose the right path or the bad path. So, it's not that easy. You're choosing between 50 degrees of gray. Which way do we go here?
Just finally, I want to quote from the end of the three questions. It's about the future. And this was written in 1998, more than 20 years ago. If the rising tide fails to lift all boats, resentments will increase. Sometimes these resentments will find their expression in too much nationalism, in resistance to immigration, in gender wars, or in varieties of religious fanaticism. Often they find a home in a climate of public mean-spiritedness that appeals to our baser instincts. So I want you to use that same crystal ball that you used 20 years ago and tell me what's going to happen in the next 5, 10, 20 years. Well, maybe that's your next book.
Yeah, the next book is called Truth and Consequences. It's going to be about, what happens when truth, and we haven't talked about truth and facts and all the role of that. Yeah, and what is true, and what is not true.
We all have our own truths.
Well, but that's not.
That's the reality, though.
No, but then you say, well, is there any such thing as objectivity? Are there any facts that people can agree on? And that's, I think, one of the key issues that we face increasingly about, well, how do we have a rational debate about politics if we can't agree on, is there such a thing as truth?
Evidence. We need evidence.
We need evidence, but we also need to have a willingness to embrace what I call these centers of objectivity. We need to have places where we agree that there will be more places that will reduce the capacity of people to abuse power. And, I think what I said in 1998 is still true. I mean, I think what I said was proved to be absolutely.
Bang on.
It was.
That's why I'm saying I want you to use that same crystal ball.
Well,
tell me what's going to happen in the next 5 years.
I think we face what we face now are even more intense challenges, because the structures in the world that we created after World War II to kind of deal with a post-war structure. That world is gone. Trump didn't Brexit didn't so much blow it up as really just express its most loud decline. But we now have to face up to the fact that we're going to have to rebuild. And I'm not so much predicting. I don't predict what will happen as much as say there are still opportunities for people to do the right thing, but it's going to require.
What does rebuild mean, though? What does it mean?
Well, you've got to rebuild the world of the rule of law globally. We need to keep on finding ways for people to accept diversity and accept an incredibly complicated and difficult, challenging world in ways that say that nationalism as it's currently being expressed in the world is not a healthy thing. It's not a good thing. It can be very destructive.
Yeah, look what it ended up in.
And that is heightened by the threat of climate change and the reality that the planet itself is at stake. And I'm not a prophet of doom. I don't believe in that, because I believe a lot in the capacity of each generation as time comes up. And for the longest time, I was saying to people younger than I was, I said, "It's your turn. Get into it. You too." And the thing that encourages me the most about what we're seeing today is that it's 12-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 16-year-olds getting in. That's the generation, and more power to them. And hopefully in the next 20, 25 years, I'll still be around, able to watch what's going on and participate in it.
Well, thanks for participating in this.
Thanks, good conversation.
The book is What's Happened to Politics, published by Simon & Schuster. As I say, it's a really useful blueprint. I think politicians should damn well read this and implement it.
It's still on the market. You can still buy it.
That's good.
Good price.
Same. I didn't get a chance to read the 3 questions, but it's a similar kind of approach.
Yeah.
And again, remind me, if you could, of the next book.
Well, tentatively titled "Truth and Consequences,"
okay.
And it's really about how populism and the crisis that I predicted in 25 years ago, which has now come to us, how that we require new political forces to deal with it. But in order to deal with it, we need to understand where it comes from. And it partly comes from economics. It partly comes from the inequalities and the disruptions that we see in the modern economy that are really very profound for people. Mm-hmm. And it also partly comes from the human element in globalization, which is that people are moving around. And we are looking globally at massive shifts in immigration and patterns of migration. Mm-hmm. And these are posing huge challenges for better off nations who, like us, Europeans and others. And it's created a very different political atmosphere, a very difficult climate to work in. I think we have to be aware of it. Plus climate change. You put all these things together, it's a whole new, not new, but it's a challenging time.
Just one final request. Can you just tell me what your message to Canadians is in advance of them voting?
First of all, vote. Don't give up. Don't give in to the people who say it doesn't matter and it doesn't count. And the second thing is to say vote with your reason and your passion. I don't think reason and passion are two different things. I think we have to vote with both of them. And by the way, only vote once.
Thanks very much
Thank
again
you.
for your time.
Good talking to you. Enjoyed it.
Bob Ray is a senior counsel with the law firm of Olthuis, Kleer Townshend in Toronto, and teaches public policy and governance at the University of Toronto. Thanks again.
Thank you, Nigel.